Schönen guten Tag, liebe Studenten und Studentinnen. I would like to talk to you today about Germany. I hope you won't mind that much of what I'd like to tell you is of a personal nature, and as with so many things in my life, it had its beginnings in music. I'd like you to listen to some for a few moments. When I was 13 or 14 years old, I began to hunt down new and exotic musical recordings from around the world. Well, they were new and exotic to me at any rate. I was actually on a first-name basis with the librarian at the Chandler Public Library, whose job was to acquire new CDs for their collection. His name is Peter, by the way, and he still works there. In my hunt, I came across a very interesting recording. The one that you are now hearing. As you correctly guessed, it came from Germany. Now, it may not sound like much to you today, but it was quite an experience to me back then. I didn't know what quite to make of it at the time. On the one hand, there was something oddly familiar about it. I recognized in it elements of the classical music that I was familiar with. Parts of it I thought could have been written by J.S. Bach, the great German classical composer. There was something new in it at the time for me. I later learned that it was jazzy. This was music that had elements of jazz, and it actually sparked in me a lifelong interest in that kind of music. But there was something else, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was something dark and edgy and gritty about the music I was listening to. I needed to learn more. What was it that made this odd sound I was hearing? Who wrote it? How did it come to be? So I researched it. This was music by Kurt Weill, a German composer who was active until 1950. And here he is with his wife, Lotte Lenya, who would later become a celebrated Hollywood actress. He himself lived in the US and contributed to many successful Broadway musicals. The music that you had been hearing, the music that I heard as a young man, was meant for a play, a drama. It was called an opera, but it was really more of a play with some singing. Kurt Weill wrote music for a play by this man, Bertolt Brecht. The two of these men would lead me on a lifelong obsession with their work in particular and with Germany in general. I simply had to learn more. I needed to learn about the play that went behind this music. So I dug in. It was called Die Drei-Groschen-Oper, the Three-Penny Opera, and it was based on an old English play. It was supposed to be quite wild. I needed to find images and read about what was going on in the play. It looked a little like this. Sometimes the stage was just the bare bones. At one point, the actors shout at the audience. Sometimes a sign droops down from the ceiling with a message on it. And it also used what was then a new technology, film, to project images onto the back wall behind the actors. Images that included sometimes charts and graphs and signs and jokes and messages to the audience. This was wild. At least it looked it. What was this thing supposed to be about? It's hard to summarize what this play is all about, but needless to say, it was dark and violent and gritty and edgy and funny and all of the things that interested my teenage self, of course. I needed to learn more. I needed to find it and read it. So I spent some time digging around, and eventually I came across an English translation, and I was deeply disappointed. It turns out it was translated in the 1950s. The original was supposed to use slang, German slang, or street speech, and it was translated by someone in the 1950s in England. So it was slang that was familiar to people in England in 1950. It was from a different time and a different country, and I couldn't quite understand what I was reading. Nevertheless, I recognized in it something that was deeply fascinating. So I did the next best thing. I decided I would learn German so I could read the original. I studied hard all night, and that next morning, just kidding, it would take many years, of course. But as you can see, it sparked a lifelong interest in all things German. It led to my researching German for many years, and let me tell you some of the things that I learned early on. This play was written at a time called the Weimar Republic. It came right after World War I, and it was very fascinating. But spooky. This is an image from a movie, a film, one of the first major films actually. It was called Nosferatu. It was the world's first vampire film, and it actually predated all the Dracula movies. It was in many ways a model for the more famous Dracula movies that we might be familiar with. Well, this was wildly successful at the time, and it's still a widely celebrated film. It came from one of the most advanced film industries in the entire world, that of Germany. Germany, it turns out, was a kind of cultural center for Europe. Some of the most interesting art of the time was being produced there. That image on the right is something that appears on the college dorm walls all around the world, in poster form, of course. It's by someone named Wassily Kandinsky. You may think that doesn't sound German. It's not. He was Russian. You see, people from all over Europe flocked to German art, design schools, and universities in order to take part in this thriving new culture. Wait a minute. That's not what I had read. It didn't seem to mesh with what little I had known of Germany. I had read about, remember this guy? The Kaiser Wilhelm II, Wilhelm II. Weren't the Germans supposed to be stodgy and serious and obsessed with the military? Well, in a way that was true. You see, Germany had just come from a dark kind of monarchy that was very serious, and they had a centuries-long military tradition, a kind of obsession with their military service. A lot of that changed in 1919. As you learned from Mr. Rossen, at the end of World War I, the German monarchy collapsed. Kaiser Wilhelm was kicked out, and Germany tried for the very first time an experiment in democracy. This is a copy of the German Constitution, die Verfassung, from the Weimar Republic, the new democratic republic that was set up after the Kaiser left. It was actually modeled on our own Constitution, which we studied last year. Remember all those amendments and the freedoms that were promised in there? Well, the German government tried its own hand at this kind of democracy. It had its own constitution that outlined powerful new rights for everybody. And as a result, German culture thrived and blossomed in a way that it hadn't in many years before. You see, there was something very interesting in the German Constitution, something that forbade or outlawed the government from restricting what you could and could not say. Yeah, let me say that again, because the Germans were actually ahead of the United States. They had something in their constitution that stopped the government from telling you what you could and could not say. This is something called censorship. In the olden days, the Kaiser and his government strictly controlled what went into the newspapers, and the government had the power to shut down art and other things that it didn't think was appropriate for the people of Germany to see. The Weimar Republic, of course, came at the very end of that. They said, no, we won't have this censorship. We don't want the government to restrict anything, any kind of artistic expression. There were just a few exceptions. Certain things couldn't be done in movies. And so the Constitution banned it. It gave this radical new freedom to artists. They could say and do just about anything. And, well, German culture exploded. And it was actually quite a loud and ruckus time. Some of the most interesting art in the world was produced there. This is my favorite artist. His name is Paul Klee. Recognize that? That's Senecio. Last year you guys wrote stories about Senecio for me. Paul Klee, the author, the painter of Senecio, worked at a place called Bauhaus. This was the most advanced architecture school in the entire world at the time, and it had far-reaching effects. Many of the buildings that we have in our own country, in our own city, are modeled after the kinds of architecture explored at Bauhaus. If you ever go to the campus of Arizona State University, you'll see buildings that are Bauhaus kinds of buildings. So you see, when the new constitution came and when Germany experimented with democracy, its culture exploded. I want to talk to you today about how German culture changed from those days in the Weimar Republic. And I want to talk to you about how different Germans dealt with those changes. I had the opportunity in the early 2000s, I guess a few years before most of you were born, to study in Germany. The German and American governments gave me money, actually, to do some research about German history, specifically how German history could be seen in its art and artifacts from the end of World War I through actually about the 1960s. So I packed up, and I had already studied German in college. I would learn the rest when I got there, and I headed on out across the Atlantic. And there I am. That's actually next to a statue of Bertolt Brecht, the playwright that I introduced to you earlier. There I am, probably in my early 20s, can't quite remember. Apparently this picture was taken before I learned how to smile. I was there to study German history through its art and the way people talked about art, and especially government. I was there to study how all of these things revealed history and how Germans dealt with that history over time. I had the great privilege of studying here. This is called Humboldt Universität zu Berlin, the Humboldt University of Berlin. This is a postcard from the 1920s. It doesn't look, the grounds around it at least, don't look like this anymore. You see, 5 governments have come and gone since this photograph was taken, including the one that I think you have on the top of your mind as you studied World War II. The building itself is largely the same, but the city has changed dramatically. Anyway, it was my great privilege to study there in the early 2000s. Let me tell you about some of the people who had been professors at Humboldt University. It used to be called Berlin University. This is Max Planck. He was one of the people who explored quantum mechanics or quantum physics, the weird, mysterious inner world of atoms. This is Heinrich Helmholtz. He studied acoustics, the science of sound, and how we hear. And then there was this guy. Recognize him? Yeah, Albert Einstein was actually a professor at this university where I got to study. He was there until 1928. This is what Humboldt looks like today. I was there to study the art of the past and how that revealed German history. Specifically, I wanted to understand how the German governments, there were many of them, dealt with art and how they explored freedom of expression and the kind of art that they sometimes demanded of artists. And I also wanted to see how Germans had changed. In particular, I wanted to know how they dealt with the most dramatic changes, the ones that came in 1933. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's go back to the beginning. Here's one of those wild images that I was talking about earlier. This is something called Dada. Dada. Yeah, that's exactly what I said. Dada. D-A-D-A. Dada-da-da-da-da-da. This was an art movement that started right after World War I. It was quite radical. It was a reaction to the violence and senselessness of World War I. It went against all those nasty German traditions. Well, to these people at least. These artists had served in World War I and were disgusted by the German obsession with the military. Take a look at what they've done. At the very top, on the ceiling, there's a mannequin, a life-size doll, and it's been dressed in a very prestigious, a very honorific military uniform, the uniform of an officer. The head has been chopped off, and in its place is the fake head of a pig. This is a deeply disrespectful image. How is this possible? How could this be done? Wasn't Germany supposed to be very strict? Well, because of that new constitution, artists were allowed to explore art that was sometimes deeply disrespectful. What is all this Dada stuff about? Well, the word Dada itself? Meaningless. Utterly meaningless. You see, these artists were reacting against the senselessness and violence of World War I, and they said that after all that madness, nothing really had any meaning. Some of these signs are funny, by the way. There's one on the upper left that says, "Nehmen Sie Dada ernst, es lohnt sich." Take Dada seriously, it's worth it. They actually meant the opposite of it. Silly as this may appear, and as disrespectful as this art may be, it had a message to it. I'll get to that in a second, but here's something that's pretty funny. It's pretty wild. I'd like you to listen. This is an example of Dada music.
Ba 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 ba. No, no moon on a pool. It's so.
Pretty crazy, huh? So, in summary, this was an example of some of the wild new artistic freedoms that Germans experienced after World War I when the democracy started. This was supposed to be fun, but it was also supposed to be critical of German traditions. On the one hand, Dada was silly. It really was meant to be silly. It's as silly as it appears. But it was also meant to be critical. It was meant to thumb the nose at old military traditions. And, of course, where they led. No man's land, Niemandsland, the trenches of World War I. You see, the artists who made Dada had themselves been soldiers in the Great War. You'll remember that 2 million German soldiers died in those years of World War I. Compare that to the mere 750,000 Americans who died in the American Civil War. Dada didn't last very long. It was too silly, but as you could sense, it had a serious undertone. I wanted to learn how art revealed the society of Germany in those years after World War I. On the one hand, it was full of artistic freedom and wildness, like the Dadaists. It was also a time where people were kind of throwing themselves into partying and clubbing and that sort of thing. But its art also shows another side. This is an image by George Gross. You can actually see one of his paintings at the Arizona State University Museum. It's in their permanent collection. Anyway, Gross used to be a member of the Dada movement, but he left that. And he made art that was a little more serious in its commentary, its description of the society around him. Let's look about what he was trying to show us. In the foreground, this is a German businessman. He's actually wearing a little ribbon on his jacket. This was to mark him as somebody who supported the monarchy, the government of the Kaiser. It was also to show that he was an upstanding citizen. He's rather plump, isn't he? He looks kind of silly, but he is smartly dressed. Who's that behind him? Who's the man in gray or brown? That's a World War I veteran. This, in a way, while it's not realistic in its actual artistic technique, it's realistic in describing what life was like for many Germans. Many veterans came back deeply shattered from the war. Look at him. His cheeks are sunken in. He's walking with a stick. Clearly he's been injured. There's another businessman in the scene too. He's lurking around the corner, clearly up to no good. And who's that other figure in the far background? He doesn't have a face, you notice it? He's supposed to be a worker. See how he just kind of blends in? He's hard to distinguish or tell apart from the factory where he works. A kind of faceless machine, more machine than human. German artists like Gross were describing a society that had deep problems. While there was a lot of artistic expression and great freedom and experimentation, there were a lot of problems. There was deep, deep, deep poverty. On the other hand, there was also fabulous, outrageous wealth. It turns out a lot of Germans had made a lot of money from the production of arms or weapons during World War I. That's what Gross is trying to show us. On the one hand are the widows and crippled or injured children and soldiers. On the other hand, there are the fabulously wealthy who are gambling, drinking, smoking, and playing away the day without a care in the world, so it seemed, getting richer as each day went by. This was a world that had been shattered by World War I. This image of World War I veterans, or returning soldiers, was made by Otto Dix. What was he trying to show us? You see how they're all injured? They're missing arms and legs. This, in many ways, is not an exaggeration. a whole generation of German young men were shattered by this war, this experience in World War I. Why is that one soldier wearing dark glasses? They're not sunglasses in the way that we normally think of them. Can you think of what may have blinded him? Something you learned from your study of World War I? Yeah, mustard gas. And the man next to him? He's probably experiencing shell shock. He had suffered a nervous disorder, literally damage to his nerves from the exploding bombs. The other two men are also injured, missing limbs, but they also suffer from hideously disfiguring diseases. So, for all the great abandon and celebration that came with the arts and the freedom of democracy, there was also great inequality, great poverty, and of course the suffering, the result of World War I. There was also another deep problem that lasted until the 1920s. Have you seen images like this before? These children on the left are playing with German money, the Deutschmark. The man on the right has gathered up a whole bunch of bundles of Deutschmarks, their currency or bills or money. Germany experienced a very acute problem called hyperinflation. It sounds complicated, but I think it's actually quite simple. Do you remember the Versailles Treaty that you learned about? As part of its defeat, Germany had to pay out lots and lots of money, millions and millions of marks, to the other nations that had won the war, England and France and the United States. They had to pay for the damage that they had done for really starting the war, at least from the perspective of the French and English. As a result, their economy, their money system collapsed, so much so that the money that they used no longer had any value. So for children like those on the left, it might as well have been something they could play with. It was meaningless. The man on the right in this famous photograph would have needed this kind of money in order to make very simple purchases. Let me tell you how bad it was. In 1923, that's when the inflation was at its worst. A loaf of bread would cost about 200 billion, billion with a B, 200 billion Deutschmarks, the currency of the time, just to buy a loaf of bread. In November of that year, $1 could be exchanged for 4 trillion, with a T, 4 trillion Deutschmarks. For people who weren't wealthy, of course, this was crippling. It meant hunger. It meant going without. So, it was a time of great suffering for Germany, and many people looked to their leaders to make great promises that would get them out of this global depression. There's a $50 billion bill from Germany at the time, 50 Billionen Mark. Astounding, isn't it? I want to leave you and the Weimar Republic with one more image. It's a beautiful painting. It's by a man named Max Liberman. We don't know much about him outside of the US, but he was a shining star in Germany. He was a bit of a rock star among artists. In the Weimar Republic, after World War I, he was already getting quite old. He actually died in 1935. Now, if you were living in Germany at the time, you probably wouldn't have heard that Max Liberman, the great artist behind this painting, had died. There's a reason for it. Remember, he was quite famous. You wouldn't have heard about his death because Max Liberman was Jewish. The new government that had taken over didn't want to do anything to celebrate Jewish people. In March 23rd, in fact, of 1933, Germany changed and the Weimar Republic came to an end. This is Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party. He's addressing the German government, the Parliament, or Bundestag. Reichstag, actually, it was called back then. He was speaking on the floor of an opera house. More about that later. He was announcing a new law. It was called Das Ermächtigungsgesetz, the Enabling Act. Let me tell you some of the things that this new law was supposed to do. It gave the new government under the control of the Nazi Party sweeping powers, and it deeply restricted individual freedoms. No longer could an individual enjoy what we call the freedom of the press. It gave the Führer, it gave the leader of the Nazi Party, Hitler, the power to take away freedom of expression. You couldn't write in a newspaper anything that the government didn't approve of, and there were hefty consequences if you decided to go against the will of the government. This new law also took away something that to us is unthinkable: trial by jury. That meant the government could accuse you of a crime and find you guilty without ever presenting evidence. It took away the freedom of assembly, the ability to meet with others and speak freely with them. If the government did not approve of the people with whom you were speaking and what you were saying, you might face dire consequences. How could this possibly be? How could the free society that we've seen suddenly turn into this nightmare? Partially, it was because of a series of disasters, of catastrophic events, of great unfortunate moments. In February of 1933, the year that Hitler had created that terrible law, there was a fire at the German Parliament building, the Reichstag. That explains why the German Parliament was now meeting in an opera house nearby. The Nazi Party had just come into power, but only barely. Hitler was democratically elected. But when the fire broke out, the Nazi Party panicked in a way, and it seized the opportunity to take control, to become an all-powerful government. It rounded up 5 people that it accused of creating the fire. Only one of them would actually be found guilty or convicted by the courts of the time. Hitler was furious, of course. He thought all 5 people should be found guilty, even if there wasn't enough evidence. He hated the results so much that his enemies hadn't been fully punished that he decided to end the court system. Really, he ended courts altogether and created his own court system called the Volksgerichtshof. Today, that's what we would call a kangaroo court. Funny name, but a really dark idea. It's the idea that the government can grab you and make you go through a show trial, a fake trial, and find you guilty anyway if it wants to. That's exactly what Hitler had done. So, the society had changed from a free society to one that was under the thumb of the Nazi Party. And there was more to the Nazis than just taking away the rights of individuals. By July of 1934, Hitler was lashing out, showing his true colors. It was something called the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler rounded up enemies within his own Nazi Party, people that he didn't think were sufficiently loyal, and had them disappeared. You see, at the very center of the Nazi way of life was murder. That's how the Nazis maintained their control: violence. So, those moments in 1933 when Hitler announced his new law completely changed German society. I want to talk to you about how some of the Germans dealt with that. Not everybody was behind the Führer. First, some of the changes. Remember all those artists, the Dadaists and so on? Whatever became of them? Well, now that the Nazi government was in control, it wanted to have its say about everything, including the arts. This is from an exhibition, a show, from 1937. It's called Entartete Kunst, Degenerate Art. That means disgusting or naughty art. In this case, un-German art. You see, the Nazis had this notion that there was something that was a kind of pure German ideal, a pure German culture, and anything that didn't fit that was disgusting, entartet, or degenerate. Guess who was there? Do you see it? Look at the wall in the picture. Nehmen Sie Dada ernst, es lohnt sich. Take Dada seriously, it's worth it. That's right. The Dadaists were some of the first people whose art was gathered up and put on display as an example of the terrible enemies of the German people. That's what the Nazis were saying. Think about what that meant for their expression. I'll bet they were fearful to go on making that kind of art. This was an exhibition, and so Hitler himself showed up. Here he is standing next to a portrait. This portrait on the wall is supposed to be an image of him. He's clearly demonstrating how he doesn't look anything like it. Okay, you may or may not like the art that he's pointing to, but the message is clear. For Germans at the time, it meant, if you create art like this disgusting art, in my opinion, so the Nazis said, you will suffer consequences. There's a funny story about this, by the way. I told you that the Germans created this exhibition of degenerate or disgusting art. Well, it was wildly successful. This picture on the left shows that the admission was free, Eintritt frei. They created another exhibition of pure German art, and guess what? Not many people showed up. Turns out it was very boring. It wasn't just the arts. Music, too, was affected. This is an image that should be somewhat familiar to you. Do you remember those images we saw last year of Jim Crow? Those hateful images that made fun of black people? Yeah, this is exactly that kind of image, but it was in Germany. This was an advertisement for an exhibition of Entartete Musik, degenerate or disgusting music. And right at the top of its list, music that had thrived in the Weimar Republic. Jazz. Jazz that had its roots in African American culture in the US. But the Nazis were really strange. They associated jazz not only with black people, whom they thought were inferior, a most unfortunate belief, a disgusting, hateful idea. But they also lumped black people in, well, take a look at that image on the musician's jacket, that pin. It's a star. That's the Star of David. It's a symbol of the Jewish religion and the Jewish people. They lumped in together anything that they didn't like, and they called it degenerate or disgusting. Jewishness, Jews, African Americans, jazz, and Dada, all of these were lumped together in one big bundle of things to be hated. Jazz was so deeply despised by the Nazi Party because it was associated with black people, whom the Nazis thought were deeply inferior or worse than Germans, that they even went so far as to ban it outright. This sign from the Culture Ministry says, "Swing tanzen verboten," swing dancing, a kind of jazz dance, forbidden. Guess who was at that exhibition? Well, guess whose music was performed there? Yeah, Kurt Weill, the man who wrote the music you heard at the very beginning. Which leads me to this question. In what ways did Germans react to the changing times, to the growing menace and the villainy of the Nazi Party? For his part, Kurt Weill and Lotte Lenya, his wife, an actress, they did something that they thought was sensible. They left. They fled. First they went to Paris and then eventually the United States. They suspected, and they were right, that had they stayed, they likely would have been severely punished. Others chose to stay behind. Does that mean they all became Nazis? No, not at all. Many of those radical artists who had enjoyed the freedom of the Weimar Republic remained behind in Germany, and they actually, in the short time they were there, used their efforts to make fun of Hitler and to expose what the Nazi government was all about. This is an image by one of my heroes. I actually go to his gravesite every time I visit Berlin. His name is John Hartfield. Sounds English. He was so disgusted with Germany because of World War I, he changed his original name, Johannes Herzfeld, to John Hartfield. Anyway, he stayed behind, and he was highly outspoken. He spoke out against the Nazis. This says Adolf der Übermensch, Hitler the Superman. This was a word that the Nazi government used to describe Germans. Schluckt Gold und redet Blech. Literally, it means he swallows gold and spews tin, or speaks tin. But we could translate it as swallows gold and spews venom. What was John Hartfield saying? Hitler will take your money, he'll take everything, and he'll make a whole bunch of promises. But guess what? They're all garbage. Do you recognize the image in the background of this? That's the Reichstag, that's the Great Fire we saw earlier, the thing that gave Hitler the opportunity to take power once and for all. That horrifying-looking man in the foreground, that's Hermann Göring. He was Hitler's right-hand man, his lead henchman. He was the second most powerful Nazi in Germany at the time. This reads, Göring, der Henker des Dritten Reichs. Goering the butcher, the executioner of the Reich, the Empire, as the German regime or government was called. He was the one who presided over the execution of the man accused of the Reichstag Fire. So John Hartfield remained, and he was this critical. Look at it. That's pretty critical. He was trying to expose the violence and the false promises of Germany and the Nazi regime, the Nazi government. He was trying to show people that Hitler had made a lot of promises to end the inflation, to bring greatness to the German people and to its military. But he was trying to show that they were lies, and they were built on violence. This is one of my favorites. It says, "Hurrah, die Butter ist alle! Hooray, we're out of butter!" He was making fun of a speech that Goering had made, demanding sacrifice of the German people if Germany was to achieve greatness. He said, well, we won't become great if you get fat off of butter. You'll have to tighten your belts a little. In other words, expect hardship, expect sacrifice. This was Hartfield making fun of the harsh promises of the Nazis and the lies that were under them. How could people believe all this stuff? How could people get swept away? The same people who had loved freedom so much, how could they get swept away by the madness of the Nazi ideas? This image should give you one clue. It's an image from a movie, but it was a real event, an actual thing that happened. It was a Nazi rally or a big celebration. One reason why Germans got caught up in this, Germans unlike John Hartfield, who never believed in the Nazi Party, countless millions of Germans were swept up by the promises and the imagery of the Nazis because of things like this. This is from a movie called Triumph des Willens, or Triumph of the Will. And guess what? It is a stunningly beautiful movie. Hear me out. It's a Nazi movie, but it is gorgeous. It used some of the most advanced film techniques of the time, and it is beautiful to look at. Well, it played on people's emotions. They had been suffering because of World War I and all of the economic problems that came from it. Hitler made great promises, and he had some of the most talented artists around him to create stunningly beautiful images like this. It's called propaganda. You've studied it with Mr. Rawson. It's strong words that are meant to change your mind to get behind the government. One of the most vulnerable set of people were young people. This is a photograph that shows the Hitler youth. Their emotions were aroused by images of military success and old folk songs and images of flags and patriotism. This is one of the songs that became a kind of national anthem of Germany. It's now actually forbidden except in historical contexts in Germany today. The flag on high, the ranks tightly closed, the SA marches with quiet, steady step. The SA, by the way, those are the original stormtroopers. Yeah, like Star Wars. That's where those Star Wars stormtroopers come from the SA, later called the SS. Anyway, songs like this celebrated order and the beauty of country and German traditions, and a lot of people got swept up in it. So that shows two different ways that people reacted to the changing times. People like John Hartfield remained behind in Germany to make fun of these new, disturbing changes. Other people just got swept up in the emotions of the Nazi propaganda. There were more, though. This is one of my favorite people. His name is Erich Kessner. He also stayed behind in Germany, and he was deeply critical of Hitler. And actually, his books had been publicly burned by the Nazis, which was terrifying, but also a badge of great honor. To be burned by such a terrible group of people meant that you had wonderful ideas. Anyway, that little poem we just saw with the flags and the marching, he made his own version of it. Rumpf vorwärts beugt, es will dich eine treten, und wenn du dich nicht bückst, trifft den Bauch. Isn't it lovely? Isn't it hilarious? Oh yeah, you probably want to see the English. Bend over now, it's time to kick your butt, and if you don't stoop, we'll sock you in the gut. Don't bother asking what the others do, you can be sure they're bending over too. Erich Kessner stayed behind, mainly to take care of his aging parents, and for a while he was critical of the government. He made songs like this that made fun of people who were just blindly following what the Nazis were doing, when really the Nazis were just threatening to beat him up, or worse. Kessner eventually stopped making songs like this. By the way, there's another song much like it. Remember Brecht? He left. He had to flee. He actually fled the day after that great fire I described in 1933, because he was on a list of people that would be rounded up and executed by Hitler. He made his own version of that song we saw at the beginning. It was much more serious. The butcher calls, with eyelids tightly shuttered. The sheep march on with firm and steady tread, and those who at the yard have shed their blood before them march on with them in spirit straight ahead. Yeesh. He was saying the Nazis were like butchers, the people who chop up animals, and anyone who follows them was like a sheep. They were like sheep on the march to the slaughter. He was right. Germany under the Nazis would use violence as the main means of control. Hitler forced people like Brecht to flee. Kessner stayed behind, but he stopped making art that was critical of the Nazis. What was he afraid of? Aww, isn't that heartwarming? It's actually as heartwarming as it looks. It's from a very famous comic series called Fatah Unzone. It was made by a man named Eo Plauen. His name was actually Erich Oza. He was a friend of the other Erich I showed you. Actually, he was from a group of people called the Three Erics, 3 friends named Erich, and they were all deeply critical of the Nazis. There he is. He and his other friend Erich, not the other Erich, but this other one, called Erich Knauf, they remained behind, and they went silent for a while. They couldn't say anything that was critical or made fun of the Nazis. It didn't matter, though. They were already enemies of the Nazi Party. One evening, they were at their apartment, and they were talking. They made fun of Germany, and they made fun of the Nazi Party, and Hitler in particular. Turns out their neighbors were listening. They turned them in to the secret police. These 2 men were rounded up. They were given a fake trial, and they were set to be executed. One of them was executed by being beheaded, and Eo Plauen, the man who made Fatah Unzone, that charming image on the right, he knew that he was about to be executed. He chose to take his own life. You see, they couldn't even be critical of the Nazis in the safety of their own home. Anyone might turn them in. That's how the Nazis managed to cloud the minds of people in Germany for so long. Violence was a way of life. I want to leave you with one last way of understanding how the Germans changed and dealt with the rise of the Nazis. I want to show you some images of 3 actors. Now, they happened to come together in a movie in the 1920s. It's very famous. It's called The Blue Angel. Anyway, these 3 actors came together for one brief moment, and you're going to see how their paths split. And it tells us a lot about how Germans dealt with the Nazis. On the left is Marlene Dietrich. She was one of the most famous actresses in all the world. This is how she dealt with things. She decided to immigrate. She left Germany and moved to the United States. This was actually a big deal. She was very famous, so famous, in fact, that the leader of the Nazi German propaganda division actually approached her and asked her, begged her to stay behind in Germany to help make propaganda movies that would help tighten the Nazis' control over the German minds. She said no, and she left. But she didn't just leave and go about her business. She actually joined the U.S. war effort to defeat the Nazis. She helped the United States government raise money through war bonds to help pay for the new war under President Roosevelt. And she toured around Europe and Asia with U.S. soldiers, entertaining them and sometimes even nursing them lightly at the hospitals during World War II. She became deeply committed to trying to end the Nazi menace. She was one way, one road in the woods. This gentleman on the right, we'll get to him in a minute, but there's Marlene Dietrich with the soldiers. Take a look at this gentleman. This is Kurt Geron. He was also a very famous actor. Do you notice something about his dates? 1944. That should tell you something. He also fled Germany, like Marlene Dietrich. He left in 1933. He, however, was caught in Holland. He was caught by secret police belonging to the Nazis, who had their arms and eyes and ears in other countries. This is what happened to him next. He was confined or imprisoned in a place called Theresienstadt Konzentrationslager. Theresienstadt concentration camp. Like many enemies of the Nazi government, he was rounded up and put in a special camp. This was a very special camp, because artists and actors and musicians were confined there. Why? They were forced, against their will, to make propaganda films. Films that sent a positive message about the Nazi government, the government that had illegally confined them, that had taken them against their will and kept them as prisoners. Kurt Geron, however, did not die in that concentration camp. He was moved to another camp, Auschwitz-Vernichtungslager, an extermination camp. Along with 6 million other Roma and Jews, Kurt Geron, as you can tell, was Jewish. He was executed by the Nazis, suffocated by gas in 1944. This was the price of being an enemy of the Nazi government, being a Jew in the 1940s in Europe. Both of them fled. One of them joined the war effort, the other became a prisoner and a victim of the Nazi regime. But there was one other world-famous actor who came together in this old film long before the Nazis came to power. This is Emil Jannings. As you can see from his dates, he actually survived World War II. He was very famous, so much so that he was the first actor of any country to receive an American Oscar Award, the most prestigious award for actors in American film industries. He also decided to stay behind, like the three Erichs. But he took a different path. Not only did he realize he couldn't speak out against the Nazis, he actually aided them, he helped them. He starred in a number of Nazi propaganda films that helped share and spread the Nazi beliefs, strange and disgusting as they were. I don't think Emil Jannings really was a deeply committed Nazi. Many of his best friends were Jewish. He had no particular problem with the Jewish people. He was very naive. He wanted a job. He loved acting. I don't think that means we should excuse him. But it tells you that many people just, if they weren't swept up in all the imagery and propaganda, they just wanted to go about their lives, and so they decided to cooperate with the Nazis. Well, Emil Jannings never worked again after World War II. He couldn't. He wasn't cleared to do it. People were so disgusted by his role in helping Nazi propaganda. There was another group of people. There were very few of them. This is Klaus von Stauffenberg. In 1944, July 20th in fact, he helped lead an assassination attempt against Adolf Hitler. It involved a bomb. See that table that's exploded? Hitler was sitting at that table. For a time, the Nazi government didn't know whether Hitler had survived. He had. He had narrowly escaped. Klaus von Stauffenberg was rounded up and executed. Even those who heroically tried to end the Nazi regime through the kinds of means or methods that the Nazis knew, violence, they didn't fare very well. It was very hard to act out against the Nazis. This is an image that I took. It's a plaque by my favorite museum, my favorite theater in Berlin. It's a tribute to a man named Otto Dix. He was a doctor. Between 1940 and 1945, he secretly collected Jewish people who were deaf, blind, or mute. Those people were destined to be executed by the Nazis, or worse, experimented on with a kind of mad science, a kind of terrible medicine. He secretly collected them and protected them. and saved the lives of many people, and is now widely celebrated in Germany today. This is a man you may have heard about. His name is Oskar Schindler. In many ways, he started as a very unimpressive person. He was actually a bit of a crook in his early days. In 1939, he joined the Nazi Party. He rose through its ranks. He was assigned to a special place in Poland that was supposed to build weapons, but he used his role there to secretly rescue 1,200 Jews. He used bribery and dirty tricks to get these people to be employed to work at his factory near the Kraków-Płaszów concentration camp. This, by the way, was right next to Auschwitz, the camp where people were gassed to death. Schindler used all kinds of dirty tricks in order to save these people's lives by getting them into his factory. You see, he was actually a force for good. He tricked the Nazis. After the war, he died relatively poor, but his body was eventually moved to Jerusalem, a very holy place for the Jewish people today. He's now honored for his role in helping to save people, the victims of the Nazi government, the Jewish people. So, as you've seen, the Germans had different ways of dealing with the Nazis. Many people, millions in fact, were swept up in the beautiful imagery and the great promises of Nazi propaganda. Others went along with it because they wanted a comfortable life and weren't willing to accept the truth that the Nazi government was actually built on lies and violence. Others fled for their lives because they knew they had been critical of the Nazis in the past. A few stayed behind and remained to speak out against them. Some, like Erich Ozer and Eo Plauen, were killed for their efforts, executed for speaking out. Others, like Erich Kessner, simply had to remain quiet. They just had to go about their business making inoffensive art and never speaking out. Others, like Otto Dix and Oskar Schindler that you see there, and von Stauffenberg, the Nazi officer who tried to assassinate Hitler, they acted out in more direct ways. Schindler was more successful because he did it secretly. And you saw what happened to Stauffenberg. He was rounded up and executed by firing squad. Germany today is unrecognizable from that time between 1933 and 1945 when the Nazis controlled everything. It's now a lot more like the Weimar Republic. It's actually a thriving center of European culture. It's a bustling metropolis. It's one of Europe's biggest cities, and it's a great deal of fun to be there. Germans are now more committed to peace than many nations around the world. And the history of the Nazi menace and the Nazi villainy is something that Germans today take very, very seriously. It's something that they are quite ashamed of and have tried their best to make amends for. I hope you get a chance to go to Germany someday. What I hope you take away from this is that, one, this is all deeply fascinating. It's had me hooked for decades now. But two, we have to realize that when we speak of Germany in the World War II, it's very important that we speak of the Nazis on the one hand and Germans. We can't lump all Germans into one big group and call them Nazis. I hope that you've seen that they had many different ways of dealing with the Nazi government. To be sure, millions of people cooperated with the violence and destruction and murder of the Nazi government. But others didn't. And many heroically and not so heroically, they spoke out against it. And they had a very complicated way of dealing with these things. It tells us that history is often more complicated than it looks. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I hope I didn't speak too long. I look forward to actually seeing you soon. I hope it gets to happen. And I'd love to hear your questions and give you some more details about Germany and my experience there and my research.